Take it away, Laszlo.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Hi, everybody. My name is Laszlo Somi. I am a technical program manager on the team's engineering team. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Christian, Dave, and Rocky, who will help managing questions from you in the chat interface. Don't be shy, ask questions. We will try to answer them within the chat interface. And at the end of the call, we will have some times for question and answers where we will try to answer whatever is left the guys couldn't answer at that time. So let's start. Our agenda today, pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about the new teams transition timeline update for GCC customers. We will talk about the technical readiness pieces for each of the clients going through Mac, Web, Windows, and VDI. We will talk about migration approaches, known limitations, and recent service updates. And then we close off with Q&A. All right, updates. First and foremost, I want to talk about the timeline, and please note the timeline update in this Message Center post. I posted the link there. You will find it in your Teams Admin Center Message Center section. The current date is by June 2024, where we want to see everybody on new teams. Now, I know there are a lot of words on this page, but think of it, there are two paths you can take. One is Microsoft controlled, which is the default. If you leave it on Microsoft controlled, we will move the users to new teams with the toggle shown starting right about now, late February, March timeframe. And eventually in early May, we will start pushing out the new teams only option, where users will no longer be able to switch back and forth between classic teams and new teams. Other approach customers can take, it's using the admin controlled approach, which is anything else outside of Microsoft controlled. So you pick any of the choices, you will have until late May to use that choice, but you need to implement that change right now, okay? Make sure you apply a policy, make sure you push it out for your users, either have the toggle or don't have the toggle, classic teams first or new teams first. We will talk about, I will show you some screenshots as well. These are the two main choices. Now, hot off the press, and we didn't update this slide at this time, that we understand and we heard the feedback from customers there. Some users are not be able to install the prerequisites on time required for new teams. And for those users, we will give until 1st of July at the earliest, and admins can address those issues and meet those prerequisites specific to the operating system. So early August versus 1st of July, an MC post will come out. For GCC customers, please pay attention to that. So if you have any limitations on prerequisites, installing new teams, hopefully this adjustment will help you greatly. We will update the slides for the next section around that. But let's move on and let's talk about technical readiness for GCC customers again. New Teams client, there is nothing magical about it besides it's a new Teams client. We want you to evaluate, we want you to learn about it, and we want you to give it to your users as soon as possible so they can use the toggle, switch back and forth between classic teams and new teams, and give them the opportunity to take advantage of all the goodness. Moving forward, all investments we do in the product will be on new teams only. That's why we have this whole motion of moving from the classic teams client, which a lot of customers around the world got used to and love. But we've been running the new teams client for many months now internally to Microsoft, and roughly 180 million of customers outside already have implemented new teams client. So that we're getting a lot of feedback, we're making adjustments as necessary, but the new Teams client, by all means, is a hit with all the customers we've been talked to. So some features are changing. And you have to pay attention to some of the details, how you got used to doing them in classic teams. Some of them are changing with the new teams or the new architecture around the new teams. So I highlight a few of these as I go along. There will be 2-3 slides of this. First and foremost, that a notification is moving to the operating system from Teams. And that's important because you need to make adjustment on the Teams, on the operating system side for the Teams client to see notifications appropriately. I want to highlight the wiki retirement, which affects all clouds currently. That was the second item here. UV no longer have wiki in the new Teams client. So at the moment, we're migrating to the Notes app, and which we use OneNote for that. And once the Loop component is released for government clouds, we will migrate again to Loop to address notes taking, wiki portability between other applications. These were the two major ones on this page I wanted to highlight for you. Let's go on to the next one. On this one, I think the important one at all team contexts are moving forward will be in the new People app. Presence is coming to the People app as well. So anything you want to learn about who you're talking to or in a group conversation, you hover over the picture of the user. You can access all sorts of information around their org chart, their LinkedIn information and so on. Super important that you get used to that habitually to hover over to the or go over to the People's app as you're searching for users. Other item, it's on the bottom one here, is the search box commands are coming via service update. So / commands, activity help, files, and so on, all useful. Some people really get used to this using from the command line and prefer to use these / commands coming to new teams as well. Right. Last but not least on this one, I think the important one is the first one I really like to highlight is around the consistency with other Office application around the team following the operating system, light or dark or classic. You can adjust it under team settings, appearance and accessibility. So top right, the 3 dots next to your picture, you can do that moving forward. So covered some of the basic changes here. Now we're going to talk about the operating system specific items for new teams. And first, let's start with Windows. We want to make sure that there is a minimum version requirements are met, which is Windows 10 or higher clouds, excluding Windows 10 LTSC version. We don't support LTSC version with new teams. Very important that you have a Windows 10 or newer version on your Windows desktop. There is a minimum version for the Teams Classic app, right? That's we need to have that for the toggle to work properly for everybody in the organization. So we need the 1.6.4472 listed here. It is quite old client now, even in Classic Teams, so very likely you will have that. Now there are some enterprise channel, semi-annual, monthly enterprise channel versions you need to make sure you adhere to. That's, I think most of our customers are meeting that requirement greatly, so they update their operating system accordingly. Then I talked about the settings around show notifications banner. So notifications is moving to the operating system from Teams Managed. If you use delivery optimization, we need to make sure that the download mode 100 bypass isn't supported for this application. So most customers we work with don't use delivery optimization mode, but if you do, pay attention to this specific item, and we will distribute the deck after the call, and you will have the opportunity to use any of the links and read more about it as needed. Last but not least, I want to talk about your DLP antivirus solution on the desktop. It is important because the executable name is changing. Therefore, you must adjust your antivirus DLP settings to accommodate that. So we're moving from msteams.exe for the classic Teams client to ms-teams.exe instead. So make sure those adjustments taking place. Last thing we want to see is that your antivirus program blocking Teams from execution. So that was, again, timeline is May in 2024. That's our target. With government timeline, we've been previewing this since 2023. We released it concurrently in our government class, so you can do all this today to moving to new teams. Now let's talk about Mac OS a little bit. So the organizations who use Mac as their operating system, Mac devices, MacBook Pros, and so on, also have a minimum OS requirements. It also has a minimum classic Teams app requirements. There are a few other items you need to do on the Mac. Again, alarm notification. You have to do that adjustment on the operating system itself, just like in Windows. You need to enable screen sharing, screen recording. We provide you all the steps what needs to be done on that. Don't forget about antivirus and DLP configuration items. Applies to Mac as well. And make sure that the user is an administrator because it's required to run the setup program on these devices. So deployment is a little bit different on the Mac, but these requirements as documented here, pretty straightforward. Releasing is generally available, the Mac client as well, and you should be able to see the toggle and switch back and forth between classic Teams. VDI endpoints, please note the time. VDI endpoints have a longer time frame for adjustments. We want to make sure all the desktop clients are done, and those organizations who use VDI technology will have a little longer time to deploy the new client. Again, that is an operating system requirement, and please note that Windows Server 2016 as a host is not supported. Okay, very important that you meet the operating system requirements for your VDI solution. VDI providers, all of them are supported in this round, of course. There are some installation requirements and profile settings you need to adhere to. We documented them and published them externally. You can reach them at these links. Again, minimum application version, a requirement. WebView 2 is a prerequisite. You need to install it in your operating system, and it also applies to the desktop client as well. There are the annual, semi-annual, enterprise channel, multi-enterprise channel adjustments if needed as the minimum requirements here. You want to do settings for notification, no different, delivery optimization, no different, and virus protection and DLP exclusions, again, no different from standard operating systems. So the takeaway here on this slide is the timeline for VDI is extended to late June timeframe, early July. Right, let's talk about some few items here. I mentioned the wiki deprecation already, migration to OneNote. There is the message center post noted here. In summary, wiki is not part of the new Teams client. So you can still access that data on the SharePoint site for users, but when you go to wiki, you get to go to the details here. You will notice there is a messaging here you need to pay attention to. So for stage one, we're migrating to OneNote instead of wiki. And stage two, once the loop component is released in government clouds, we will migrate over to the loop component. I hurried up a little bit. So stage two, there is a timeline for it when you can still access it and migrate it. Stage three is the beginning of July 2024 when it's no longer available for access. Again, long-term plan is the loop component. Interim solution is OneNote. Right, next item on our list here is notes taking, collaborative notes in GCC, interim migration to OneNote. Again, all this applies to this. we want to use OneNote as the default solution for all this. So you need to enable them and you migrate your existing content to that as you see fit. Legacy components in the wiki-based meeting notes is available in the SharePoint site, so you can still access them there. Okay. Changes to website tabs within the new Teams migration. So based on updated security principles in the Chromium client, we can no longer display a web page reliably in an iframe within the Teams client. What it means is that once you have your pinned websites in a Teams and channel construct here, we will pop it out into a browser externally to the Teams client. So the takeaway is here, there are still valuable to pin web pages to a channel to highlight for your users when they need to do something or they do something often, but it will be displayed externally to the Teams client. That is the change. The rollout will begin in July timeframe 2024, and we will stop displaying web pages within the Teams client. Right? Live event support in new Teams client. There is a message center post about it also. I mentioned the number here. By late March 2024, Teams live event attendee, presenter, producer roles will be fully supported within the new Teams desktop client. So you can attend a Teams live event from any of the clients, but the scheduling component, you need to do it in a browser. We will have that also sorted. It will be parts of the new Teams client, but at this time, the browser is the only way to schedule that event. Okay. For those who develop some applications, we're notifying everybody that Microsoft Teams for Windows is discontinuing support for a legacy ADAL authentication SDK. There is the message center post about it. If you have some applications which using this ADAL SDK, you need to make some adjustment to that application. Please pay attention to this message center post. All right, let's talk about the migration piece. So we talked about the operating system, we talked about prerequisites, we talked about VDI and what is needed. Now let's talk about the actual migration piece and what an administrator will need to do. Here I'm showing you Teams update policies and showing you all the options for the new Teams client update. By default, it is Microsoft controlled. So if you don't do anything, it will remain on Microsoft controlled, and it aligns to the timeline I said it on the beginning of this presentation. All other choices are admin choices. So you will have additional time when you use admin control to move to new Teams. But either choice, Microsoft controlled or all others, will end up at new Teams only. New Teams only is the final destination for all policies, and regardless of your starting point, we will move you to new Teams only at the times we described earlier. Okay, so not enabled, your users don't have the toggle, they don't have the choice to test drive the new Teams client. Classic Teams as default means by default you start in the classic Teams, but you have the toggle to get to new Teams. New Teams as default, reverse of that, you have new Teams by default, you're using the new Teams client day to day, but you can switch back to classic Teams if needed for whatever reason. New Teams only, you completed your migration, you move forward to the new Teams client, and you are already ahead of the curve. Okay, very straightforward. We advise customers in a larger deployment that stage these admins rollout to roughly less than 50,000 users at the time. So it's not Friday, you apply a policy to several 100,000 users for Monday morning to make this change. So I generally always advise the customers I work with, don't change the global settings. That way you can always get back into a working mode. create a custom policy, use group policy assignment as you see fit, and stage this out to however you want to bin up your users, roughly less than 50,000 user chunks. The current guidance, we will have some message center post about it coming shortly, but at this time, I'm just verbally telling you what that content is going to be roughly. Okay. Now we need to deploy the client, and we can deploy the client using the download installer. You can bootstrap it, Teams Bootstrapper -P. You can display any of these pieces for the users. You can do it in the background for them. You can deploy it with any of the automation capabilities we have, Intune, endpoint configuration manager, group policy, or any other third-party device management you're using. Okay. Teams as the new default client. When the users sign into that client, the policy, we will check for the policy, what is applied to them, and make the adjustment on the client side of what we need to display, how we need to display, showing a splash page for the users to move forward to Teams, or tell them that, hey, new Teams is available for you, and switch them over to the new Teams. Super important again, that our goal destination in all these scenarios is new Teams only by default. That is what everybody will have at the timelines I communicated earlier. All right. New Teams client installation via Microsoft Apps. Also a choice here. Will be soon be installed via the existing Microsoft 365 app installation based upon the channel you have selected for your users. You can exclude it, include it in the default installation, how you install your Office packages. I heard it today that customers started seeing this as parts of their Office package, that the new Teams client is available. Once the client is installed, just like any Office application, updates will be automatically applied to them once the user logs on. The Teams desktop client will always update itself outside of that Office channel updates, which you, based on the choice you made of which package you deploy, how the Office packages are installing. Okay, very important. Teams client updates itself after installation when the user sign on, regardless of the Office package they installed with. Okay. Classic end user migration experience, end user settings will be migrated at once when the user first launches the new Teams client. So as you're switching back and forth, perhaps, if the user have an expectation that any changes they make on their theme, devices, default devices, and so on, they will not be reflected in the other application. We will do this once, the first time the user launches the new Teams client. Whatever the settings at that time, based on these categories on the left here, we will migrate those settings and then never look back. So if you start making adjustment to devices or background images and so on, and you're switching back and forth between classic Teams and new Teams, you need to do that manually instead. Right, preparing for new Teams, migration experience, classic Teams client, the user has the toggle, or they get a notification via the splash that new Teams is installed and ready to use, switch, or switch when I am not using Teams. Then they launch the new Teams client from that point forward. Very straightforward. Some customers really like this splash to notify the users that new Teams available because they're not going to notice this toggle on the top left. Some users did not. This is where we landed for the new Teams client. So moving forward, this is the experience we can expect instead. We launched a new report in the Teams Admin Center. So administrators can look at client version usage. Okay. The columns are username, display name. classic or new Windows, application version a particular client is using, and so on. Super important. That's how you can know when you apply the policy, how long does it take to get to the users. So some important items around here, it may take up to 48 hours for usage details to fully update. So pay attention to that. Is not an immediate thing like most policies in Teams. Post new Teams transition, you can continue to use this report proactively, mitigate version conflicts or users who are lagging behind some updates for whatever the reason may be. So make sure that you check here. It's a good troubleshooting tool as well moving forward for users. What is the version they're using, and make sure that they are on the latest and greatest. You can always update manually or check in for a new version. A new Teams, no limitations. So there are a few items we want to talk about here. PowerPoint Live Standout isn't available yet. That's a pretty common account. Another one I get asked quite a bit about is cross-cloud guest access. Are not yet shown on the Teams web client, so this feature is not available. If you have cross-cloud guest access set up and you need to switch between clients and you're using the web interface, you need to open a new web interface to log into that tenant instead. Very important. This item is the one I get asked about the most in recent days, so I just wanted to highlight as we talk. The link, no new Teams, no limitations. We continuously update it. Make sure you take a look at it as you get a chance for the latest news. All right, new Teams, recent service updates. So we made quite a bit of changes. If you came to a previous session a few weeks ago, we released a lot of items. So that was early March, late February when we did that. Current releasing a few items with the current client release, and planned items for late March 2024. So in a few days' time is also coming. Teams clients generally update every 2-3 weeks. That's roughly the general what you can expect. You can always check in for the latest update from the desktop client. Click on the dot and follow the instructions there. The client will also check for the latest updates when the client is idle for a period of time. So please let them update. Don't just shut them down. Super important for us that all clients are on the latest release. Anything we fix based on support tickets and we built it into the next release of the product or maybe 2 releases from now, you're only going to take advantage of that if you have the latest client. We can't emphasize it enough that these updates are very important for the client to work efficiently and make sure everything is there what we want. All right, this is my last slide. A few reminder links here which are useful for the community, end user adoption and readiness, the technical readiness items I talked about, latest updates on the new Teams client. Everything I talked about, we have it available on the web also. And at this time, I will ask my colleagues if there is any questions we can publicly answer here. Come off mute and then ask away.
Yeah, thanks, Laszlo. There were a few questions, but Dave's been great that where we're responding directly via chat. There are a couple. Cameron, I'm not exactly sure in regards to your question where you're asking, are in and out times logged for user auditing? I don't know which slide that was. That was maybe a couple minutes ago.
Oh, that was the client version logged, but it doesn't show when the user logged on and logged off. Is it relate to time attendance reporting type of scenario? Then maybe the shift application is what I can recommend you take a deeper look at. Logs on Azure AD side, I mean, obviously you could look at that as the timestamp when a user did something in Azure AD, I wouldn't rely on that as a time attendance reporting type of scenario. Shift the application would be the direction I would guide you to.
Okay, Cameron, let me know if that answer suffices for you in the chat. Are we still going to have issues with stale versions in user profiles?
User profile cache or in a VDI scenario, I need a little more context for that question. Stale versions are always a problem, as I talked about this. That's why the client makes an attempt to update itself when the client is idle. You might have seen on the top right a little update button pops up occasionally, and then you can click on it manually to apply the update, or you can manually check for a new version. But the client, generally speaking, provided it has access to update services, will do the update itself without user having to do anything, unless you actively trying to block update services. You should not have a stale client in your environment. It will take maybe a week or so after the latest release is available for your tenant, that every user in the organization, but I don't expect the drift to be larger than a few weeks time at the very most.
Got it. And then furthermore, Dave just posted in our internal chat, for the stale versions, this should also be mitigated with new teams unless there's a security restriction blocking.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned, is blocking the web services to be able to reach out to teams to download that update or apply that update. Some customers are actively doing that, but they provide another update method for those clients in certain environments. But by large percentages, the client should be able to update itself without any user interventions.
And then for that clarification about this regarding is it VDI or cache mode or whatnot, it's typically for users in a shared use device that may not have logged into the machine for a while.
Yeah. So I didn't talk about the new architecture for the new clients. It's MSIX installer, what we use, and even on a shared environment, when you have updates applying, it applies to all updates, all profiles in the environment. So the user must be able to log on. So when they log on the first time, there is a schedule being set to update the client. And it's a machine-wide installer. So components of the Teams client will be updated regardless how many profiles you have. Obviously, those need to be active profiles. The users need to sign on. But the drift of some users have one version of the client versus 5 releases newer for some other user is what the MSIX installer will help alleviate.
Got it. Thank you, Laszlo. Another question. I'm not sure if this is going to be related. Any improvement with sign language mode?
So in settings, there is a new settings that we enlarge the sign language window. We have some new features coming along, which makes that easier to bring in a sign interpreter in the environment. Please get that information from the person who asked the question, and we can get back to them on the details around that.
Okay. Daniel, if you can DM me directly, if not, then or have the CCM reach out to Teams Engineering. I just don't know if Daniel wants to put his contact info for the world to see. Brent asks, in new Teams, we are unable to manage a Teams meeting from inside of Outlook. Should this be working?
I think is the question regarding the Teams meeting add-in. We had some issues with it. The latest release should fix that. So make sure you have the latest client applied, which is the late February client, what was pushed out. It has a fix in it. I think there are one other open case I am aware of we are still working on. The update should come early next week. I think it was the latest what we talked about. But yes, we are aware of the problem and it's being fixed.
All right. We have had a problem with the toggle working on our Windows 10 computers. The quote unquote org is installing new teams, pop-up appears, but it sits there forever. Are there known group policies that interfere with the toggle working? We have scoured our policies and tested for days and cannot get to the bottom of it.
I am not aware of other group policies conflict with it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I would suggest please open a support case, and the support engineer can escalate it towards Teams engineering if you need to take a look at something systematic, and they can troubleshoot it.
Also,
one more item. Please check the prerequisites that the desktop has prerequisites installed as described. WebView 2, namely, would be the most important one.
Will there be a release for notifications on user status availability change?
Oh, like we had in Sky for Business, that is? I assume that is what the question is about, that the user is available or not available. I'm not aware of a work item coming around that. It's been asked because it was a parity item with Sky for Business client, and a lot of organizations rely on that notification that the user became available and so on. But Sky for Business was not a persistent chat environment. Teams is a persistent chat environment. So what the user's presence is probably less important at this time. I'm speaking from personal experience here. I don't really look at what the user presence is. I ask my questions whatever I want, and then whatever I need, and then I wait for the reply. It stays persistent, so it doesn't get lost when the user logs out and logs back in. And that's present, it lost its importance like it had in Sky for Business. With that said, we recognize it's a common ask, and we've been asked this before, but we don't have a solution for it at this time. Please monitor the release notes, what we have in the Teams client, or roadmap items, what we publish publicly, and look for that item for you want. Okay.
Has there been any compatibility issues with Teams running in Cisco Roomkit? And then there's an asterisk next to it that says Cisco Roombar Pro specifically.
Is that the Android version of the Cisco device, which can switch between Teams and native WebEx environments, I assume?
I'm going to wait for a response from Michael for that clarification. Another question. For new teams, is there also a new Outlook plugin, and will that be part of the installation?
It is parts of the installation. I don't know it's a new plugin or is the same plugin we had with classic Teams. I wonder if it's related to that same item the previous user was asking, that it doesn't show up correctly or doesn't show up at all and you can't control meetings. While we're dealing with that and the new Teams client installs, which also should update that Outlook add-in, keep in mind you can always schedule a meeting from Teams itself, going to the calendar and access it from there. So while we push out the new Teams update and the Outlook add-in gets updated and shows up in Outlook as expected. Keep in mind the web interface or the Teams desktop client calendar section. You can always create a Teams meeting there as well.
Got it.
I know it's a workaround, but that's the best I can advise you at the moment.
Yeah, Dave also touched on it in the meeting chat. He says it's a updated meeting add-in with new teams, but the same functionality.
Yep.
Cool. Going back to the question about the Cisco Room Kit, Cisco Room Bar Pro, you mentioned the Android that flips back and forth. That's what Michael says. Yes, they run Android, and that's the question that they were asking about compatibility issues with teams running on it.
You need to be specific. I found it, well, I searched for it really quickly as listed as a team solution. We need to understand what the specific issue is. Generally speaking, please open a support case with support services and they can escalate to us, to Teams engineering, if it's a systematic issue we need to address. We have customers who started using these devices or started experimenting with them. I have not heard any compatibility issues as mentioned. So that's why I'm asking to be more specific, please.
Got it. Would you also advise them to just have them reach out to their CSAM here?
Always.
Got it. Cool. Is Microsoft able to tell how users are migrating to Microsoft or to new teams? Are they taking a phased-in approach with the toggling between classic and new teams, or are they rolling out with new teams only without a phased approach? Does Microsoft have a preferred migration process? If there is, why one migration process over the other?
Great question. It's a single-minded goal that everybody gets the new teams as fast as possible for us. We realize that as parts of this migration, there will be some user impact, how they do things currently, some features they rely on at this time, and they may or may not exist in new teams, or some things you have to do differently. So I'm coming from an IT background. My preference would be that I give the user the capability to switch to new teams and then give me feedback if there are any issues I need to address, or go to the vendor, in this case, us at Microsoft, to fix items. So that is my preferred approach, always to give the users the capability to use the new product, but be able to switch back, which is exactly what we did. Now, some organizations, because of some dependencies, prefer the user not be able to use the new client because whatever item we have issues with, until we fix that particular item, which in the new updates we certainly do. As I mentioned, every month there is generally 2 updates we push out to the Teams client. So in those instances, apply the policy to remain on classic teams and don't switch over to new teams until you as IT verify that that item got sorted in the latest release. With that said, Microsoft is already using new teams. We cannot switch back to classic teams anymore. And we are a quite large organization doing that. So we have companies, governmental, commercial, who was very aggressive, moved to new teams very aggressively. We thank you for that. But depending how much user pain are you willing to put on your users, especially if you were deeply adjusted to classic Teams client, or you use some applications which may not work in new teams. You know your users best, so make sure you apply the appropriate approaches. There is no right or wrong, whichever way you go. That's my general guidance. Listen to your users.
Got it. And Dave, do you want to chime in here on the customers that you've covered?
Yeah, thanks, Rocky. Yeah, to add what Laszlo summarized, I would say with several of the state local government agencies we've worked with, it has been a mix. There are those that are looking to continue forward with Microsoft controlled. They just want Microsoft to manage that experience for them, or they're choosing to manually control the experience instead. What's feeding into that for considerations is some state local agencies are quite complex in how the coordination needs to be required to finalize a change like this across their agency. So Microsoft Control better fits the bill for that. The other thing that may lean towards going with a manual managed approach instead is that with Microsoft Control, you don't have specificity to say when a user will get new teams or an update to a new team's policy on a specific date. Whereas if you manage that transition yourself instead, a lot of those controls are available. And then in terms of approach, I would say the way most customers are approaching this is obviously they're doing a pilot. They're leveraging that to build up their early adopters, their internal champion experts within the agency, if you will. And the way they're doing that is they will stage starting with classic teams by default. So as Laszlo mentioned, that allows them to see the toggle or have access to it. They can choose to self-serve enabling it. That will install new teams, and they can switch back and forth. The next stage then is they will take that same group and level that up to new teams by default. So basically gives the same capabilities, just has new teams as the default client. And then once that's set, assuming having all the supporting ACM framework and supporting resources in place, they're then either taking stages by department or finalizing the change tenant-wide to then either go to new teams by default with new teams only as the final step, or they just go directly to new teams only instead. So as Laszlo noted, as you look at some of the different considerations, different parts of the journey along the way, there is no right or wrong approach. It just really comes down to those considerations and what works best for your organization.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Laszlo.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if this is on the roadmap, but is there a plan for an on-prem version of Teams?
No. It's a cloud application. And the short answer is no. The long answer is that it's a microservices architecture, so it's not a server product like you used to with Exchange or other Office applications where you run a single server running every component of that application. Teams have tie into Exchange, have tie into SharePoint, have tie into AD, OneDrive, and so on. We never planned. This was a very common question on the beginning when we started working with Teams about 5 years ago of when is the on-prem version coming? It is not coming. I would be interested to know what is the driver behind that question, why are you asking that? And perhaps we can architect something around to address some of those concerns. A very common concern in these scenarios is local survivability for voice applications. And let's talk about that separately. We're really focusing on the new Teams client in this presentation today. But if the person asking that questions want to talk about that a little further, I would be happy to take that and talk to them.
Cool. Is the machine-wide installer no longer needed? And should the existing one be removed? Okay to remove after?
Okay, so after you update to the new Teams client, after about 2 weeks, the classic Teams client, we will make an attempt to uninstall it. If we don't have access to the machine-wide installer because the user is not an administrator on the local machine, we will not be able to remove the machine-wide installer, and you as the administrator need to do that. I would uninstall it at some point if the user is getting a new workstation or a new operating system update with a new Office update. As parts of that update, you can wait to uninstall the classic client. There is no way for the user, once the policy applied for new Teams, only to go back to classic Teams. And at that point, it is just dormant files on the machine that is not running any service scenarios where somebody could connect to it or do anything with it. So as a best practice, as the machines gets updated, definitely make sure the Classic Teams client is no longer installed. We will make an attempt to uninstall in the user profile the Classic Teams client, and the machine-wide installer, if that's how you deploy the Classic Teams, and you have the processes in place, by all means, do remove it a few weeks after you switched over to the new Teams client. Long answer to a short question.
They're using Skype in their offline environment and would love to use Teams, of course.
Yeah, no. The cloud service, you need to be able to connect to the cloud to consume that service. If your requirement is to continue, Skype for Business is still a product today. You can deploy, you can update in an on-prem environment. But as you adopting the cloud, then it's Teams only.
Cool. Are there any changes to Android and iOS? I imagine this is mobile here at Laszlo.
Yeah, we will update those as well, but those are separate environments from the desktop clients. This update cycle, we're focusing on Windows, Mac, VDI, and the web browser client to be updated to the new Teams client. Android and iOS it's a unique form factor, of course, and we always adjust the product to those form factors unique to that environment. And at this point, Android and iOS client are actually ahead of this curve. You already have an updated client, which is aside from the desktop client. It is a modern client already.
Cool. It doesn't look like we have any last questions here. Going once,
All right.
going twice. Yeah, I think that is it. Laszlo, Dave, you want to close us out?
Well, thank you very much, everybody who came today and to our previous sessions. I think we will have another cycle of these updates in the coming weeks. And Dave, keep me honest on that regard. And thanks again, anybody who came. Okay.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.